Let's take a look at a sample comparison contrast essay of two poems. Now, this comes from a textbook, so you will not be writing about either of these poems, and we have not read these poems in this class. But I think looking at an example essay, obviously this is an A essay in my book, and the textbook has included it as an example of an A essay. I think it's worth taking a close look at. And by the way, this is not in our textbook. This is in a different textbook. But if you want to go through this essay on your own and look at it in more detail and look at it as inspiration, you can find this under Files and under Sample Compare Contrast essay. So let's take a look. It's called The Treatment of Responses to War in Lowell's Patterns and Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth. I'm not going to read through the entire essay with you. I just want to focus on a couple key parts, the intro and a couple of body paragraphs in particular. Patterns and Anthem for Doomed Youth are both powerful and unique condemnations of war. Owen's short poem speaks broadly and generally about the ugliness of war and also about large groups of sorrowful people. Lowell's longer poem focuses on the personal grief of just one person. In a sense, Lowell's poem begins where Owen's ends, a fact that accounts for both the similarities and the differences between the two works. The anti-war themes may be compared on the basis of their subjects, their lengths, their concreteness, and their use of a common metaphor. So let's stop to unpack what this intro does well. You can do better, but this intro is an A-level intro. So first off, there's some context. It includes the name of the authors or the name of the poets and the name of the poems. And remember, poems, short works like short stories or poems, those get put in quotation marks. Long works like novels or plays, those are in italics. But here we're talking about poems like Patterns and Anthem for Doomed Youth. So those should go in quotation marks for the titles of short works. So there's a little bit of context, and then there is a thesis at the end of the intro. What I like about this thesis is it goes well beyond just saying there are similarities and differences between the poems. In fact, if in your thesis you basically just say there are many differences and similarities between the two poems, you're saying something that is kind of true of any two things, right? There are many similarities and differences between a candlestick and a light bulb, or an apple and an orange, or a shoe and the Eiffel Tower. You could say that about anything. If I can plug in your thesis and say it about pretty much anything, or if I can plug in your thesis to other works of literature and your thesis still makes sense, that actually is not a good sign. That means your thesis is vague and imprecise. So you want to go beyond saying there are similarities and differences. Yes, this thesis does, or right before the thesis, it does mention the word similarities and differences, but it goes well beyond that. It says one poem picks up where the other begins, and this fact accounts for the similarities and differences. And then it goes way beyond that. It mentions the thematic connection between the two poems. So both poems have anti-war themes, and then it gets into the specific points that this writer is going to compare and contrast. Subjects, lengths, concreteness, and common metaphor. And notice how some of those things, I suppose, are a little bit obvious, right? Like subjects and lengths. But things like concreteness and use of a common metaphor, those are not obvious, points of comparison and contrast. So these are points that are thoughtful and that the person does a really good job of unpacking and comparing and contrasting in a real way later on in the poem. So there's a list of the points of comparison and contrast. In this case, there are 4 points of comparison and contrast: subjects, lengths, concreteness, and use of a common metaphor. And all of those things connect back to anti-war themes. Notice how the thesis is near the end of the intro. That is important. Let's look at the first topic sentence. Anthem for Doomed Youth attacks war more directly than Patterns. So in the topic sentence, there's a mention of both poems, right? Both poems need to be mentioned in the topic sentence because using point-by-point format, like you've learned, means that each body paragraph focuses on one specific point about both poems or both things you're comparing and contrasting. Which means your topic sentence has to mention both poems and the point of comparison and contrast. So here it has to do with their subject, right? Also connecting back to anti-war themes, how one is attacking war more directly, and it mentions both poems. The first part of the poem is about Owen's poem. The first part of the paragraph is about Owen's poem. The second part of the paragraph is about the other poem or Lowell's poem. But there's also a little bit of back and forth. There's some mention of patterns a little bit up here and some mention of Anthem for Doomed Youth down here. It's okay if it's not like the first half of your paragraph is all about poem 1 and the second half of your paragraph is all about poem number 2. Notice how there are quotations from both poems. You need one quote from poem A and one quote from poem B. You can have more, of course, and remember with poetry, even just 1 or 2 words can be really effective because you can really unpack those specific words, right? Poetry is really dense, so your quote can even just be 1 or 2 words, but you have to have at least one quote per poem in that body paragraph. And everything in the body paragraph should be comparing and contrasting that one point that you're making about both poems. Notice how this essay uses a lot of transitions. So we have words like by contrast or a comparable situation or thus. If we scroll down a little bit further, just by skimming it, you can see more transitions like on the other hand or nevertheless or in contrast or although. For compare-contrast essays, you're going to have to use a lot of transitions. A good writer uses transitions so seamlessly that you don't even really notice all the transitions until you're looking for them. Let's look at one more topic sentence. Another difference is that Owen's poem is less than 1/7 as long as Lowell's. So when I first look at this topic sentence, I think, well, how is that interesting? How is that going to be worthy of an entire paragraph, that one poem is shorter than the other? That doesn't really seem like an insightful observation. But actually, if you go through the entire paragraph, you realize that the length of the poem is actually really important, that the lengths have meaning. So you don't want to just compare and contrast something based off of a point that's just kind of an obvious or not very interesting observation. It's only if you're going to tell us the so what or the significance of that observation. Like, why does it matter that one poem is shorter than the other? Who cares? What does that mean? How does that connect to a theme? It's only if you can do that that it's worth talking about. And this person does that really nicely. Let's look at the last sentence. In contrast, Lowell tells one of these stories as she focuses on her solitary speaker's lost hopes and dreams. Thus, the contrasting lengths of the poems are governed by each of the poet's treatment of the topic. So here there's the so what. Why does it matter that one poem is shorter and one poem's longer? This is the so what or the significance. And of course, there are quotes for both poems. One more example of a topic sentence before we move on. Despite these differences of approach and length, both poems are similarly concrete and real. So what I like about this topic sentence is there's a transition from the point of this paragraph, which had to do with the length of the poems, and the point of this next paragraph, which has to do with this concreteness, this tangible quality. And so there's a transition, referencing what the previous paragraph is about and then referencing what this paragraph is going to be about. You want to make sure you have one quote from poem A, one quote from poem B in the paragraph. But most of this essay is following the exact format that I want you to use. I also notice that this essay seems to use emphatic order. That means saving the most powerful example for last. So it goes from kind of the more obvious points of comparison and contrast to the much more sophisticated, nuanced points of comparison and contrast, right? Moving from things like length to concreteness to the major metaphor about human wishes and hopes. So this paragraph, in my opinion, is the strongest. That's why the writer chose to save this paragraph for last. You don't have to use emphatic order. You could use some sort of other order technique that makes sense to you, like chronological order. But do think about the order of the points that you present in your comparison and contrast essay. I always think emphatic order works really nicely. Notice how also that the conclusion doesn't just summarize everything the writer has just said. You want to go beyond that in your conclusion. And sorry, this PDF kind of cut off a little bit on the side. You want to end your essay always in this class by echoing your thesis, but don't just cut and paste it, say it in a fresh way. And then providing memorable concluding words, right? Thoughtful concluding words that give us a sense of the so what or what's at stake, why does it matter, connect it to something bigger, bring in an alternative argument, talk about other areas of literary criticism that a scholar could dive into. You don't just want to end by summarizing everything you've just said and just kind of hashing out all of your points all over again. You want to give your conclusion some thought and open up your essay rather than just rehashing everything you've just said. So take a look at this. You might find it helpful. Notice since this was published in a textbook, you're not going to see the full MLA format header. Obviously, this should be double spaced, but most of this essay is using MLA format minus the spacing and things like that. Most components of this essay, I think, are really effective. Obviously, this would be an A in my book. If I were to take a look at the rubric for our class, for our take-home essays, I would give it at least a 4 in pretty much every category, probably a 5 in every single category. So look at this rubric to get a sense of what I'm looking for. Remember, this rubric is the same for all take-home essays, so you've seen this before. Things like your thesis statement, the overall organization, body paragraphs. I want to see those integrated quotes with parenthetical citations. Remember, for poetry, in parentheses, you should have the line number as opposed to the page number. So you have to look at the side of the poem or actually count how many lines down your quote is. Literary analysis, and then, of course, mechanics, language, making sure that your essay meets the requirements, is long enough, uses MLA format, has a works cited page, things like that. So I hope that helps. I think seeing a model can always be helpful. And please do keep this in mind also when you do your peer edit.